Hello and welcome to our Lunch and Learn series. My name is Giza Lopez and I am the Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. A quick shout out to our YJI scholars who have joined us this spring. The work that you do at the Institute is very important and we are ever so proud to have you on the team. As always, many thanks to our partners in New York State. It is their support that allows us to bring this series to you. The Division of Criminal Justice Services, the Office of Children and Family Services, the University at Albany, and the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. Thank you. I also want to thank each of you for joining us today in this virtual space and for making time to learn more about research into youth justice issues. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and to tell us where you're from. Today is a special date as we celebrate Happy Tuesday. 2/22/22 is a ubiquitous palindrome, and if you have little kids at home, I hope very much you will find a fun way to mark this unique day. But today is also special because we get to spend the next hour in your company and with Dr. Cortney Simmons. It is a pleasure to have you, Dr. Simmons. I'm looking forward very much to your presentation today, as I mentioned earlier to you. Without any more delay, Tony, take it away. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Youth Justice Institute's Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name is Tani Cruz, and I'm a graduate research assistant here at the YJI. Before we begin today's webinar, I do have one announcement to make. The Long Island Regional Youth Justice team in New York State recently completed its Words for My Soul project. This project encouraged youth voice through theater and storytelling. Participating youth created 10 short videos about their stories, and professionally drawn digital illustrations accompany each video. After the closing announcements today, we will be showing one of these videos, which will last no longer than 2 minutes, so feel free to stick around and view this amazing work. Now, I think that we're all really looking forward to today's presentation, so I don't want to further delay hearing from Dr. Cortney Simmons. Dr. Simmons is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Psychology at Yale University. Dr. Simmons received her doctorate degree from the University of California, Irvine, specializing in developmental psychology and quantitative methods. Her research integrates concepts and methods from developmental psychology, criminology, and neurobiology to examine how individual and environmental factors contribute to antisocial psychopathology in adolescence. Her current work centers on two specific areas: identifying and understanding the developmental changes in psychopathic traits and the contributing role of the environment, and identifying cognitive and affective processes associated with antisocial psychopathology. Dr. Simmons has several publications in top journals, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Child Development, and her work has received recognition from the American Psychological Association and the Society for Research on Adolescence. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Cortney Simmons.
Thank you for that warm welcome. And then also thank you to the Youth Justice Institute for inviting me here today. I'm very excited to talk to you all and share what the science has to say about psychopathic traits in youth. So let me share my screen. Can you all see my slides? Perfect. Well, before I begin with the science, I first want to know, what do you all think when you hear the term psychopathy? You can enter your thoughts into the chat. Scary, unsafe, mental illness, unstable, mean, mental asylum, lack of remorse, trauma. A lot of good responses. And thank you for participating. So many people, when they hear the term psychopathy, tend to think of murderous New York bankers depicted in American cinema. Maybe they think about serial killers who have taken the lives of many innocent men, women, and children. And you might also think about kids who seem to be almost born innately evil. Now, despite these ideas, we know that psychopathy is not limited to violent and dangerous people in our society. In fact, approximately 1 in 100 people have elevated levels of psychopathic traits. Now, given that psychopathy is fairly misunderstood, I first want to define psychopathy as a construct. Now, psychopathy is a mental health problem that is comprised of 4 facets. The first is an interpersonal facet, which encompasses characteristics like superficial charm, pathological lying, and manipulation. It also includes an affective facet, which includes characteristics like a lack of remorse or guilt, callousness or a lack of empathy, and a failure to accept responsibility for one's actions. There's also a lifestyle facet, which includes characteristics like impulsivity, irresponsibility, and a lack of long-term goals. And it also includes an antisocial facet, which includes behavioral outcomes like early behavioral problems, juvenile delinquency, and criminal versatility. Now, psychopathy is not currently represented in the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that clinicians use to classify mental health disorders. Used to classify mental health disorders. However, among children and adolescents, with the combination of conduct disorder, the presence of affective features may lead youth to be classified as having limited prosocial emotions, or what we is often commonly referred to as callous unemotional traits. The combination of conduct disorder and CU traits in children and adolescents are believed to be the developmental precursor of psychopathy in adulthood. So throughout this presentation, I'll use the term psychopathy and callous unemotional traits, depending on how these construct was measured in the studies. So psychopathy overall is related to a host of maladaptive outcomes, including poor mental and physical health, relationship problems, and academic and employment problems. But perhaps the maladaptive outcome most relevant to this audience is antisocial behavior. What we see is that youth with psychopathic traits are at higher risk for engaging in aggressive behavior, have an earlier onset of delinquency, and engage in criminal behaviors that are more likely to persist across the lifespan. Now, the robust association between psychopathy and antisocial outcomes have resulted in certain myths about psychopathy, including that these traits are stable across lifespan, that youth with psychopathic traits are not influenced by environmental factors or conditions, and that youth with psychopathic traits are not responsive to treatment. And these myths have important implications for how youth are evaluated and treated within legal contexts. So research has found that youth with psychopathic traits are perceived as more dangerous, are expected to recidivate at higher rates, receive fewer treatment referrals, and are more likely to receive harsher sentencing decisions. And these findings are particularly concerning in light of Supreme Court decisions regarding incorrigibility, or the ability to change or respond to rehabilitation. So in this decision, the court ruled that a sentencing authority need not find a youth permanently incorrigible before imposing a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. So today, in my presentation, I hope to detail evidence that counters the myths about psychopathy, with the hope that you will no longer perceive psychopathy as an indicator of incorrigibility. So now I'm heading to my next question for you all. What causes psychopathy? Is it genetics? Is it environment? Or is it a combination of both? Getting some good engagement. Thank you all for answering. So about 96% of you viewed or responded that psychopathy is a result of both genetics and environment. And you all must have taken some sort of child or adolescent development class, because developmental psychologists like myself also view that behavior and development is a product of both nature, such as genes, and nurture, such as the environment in which youth are raised in. And the same is true for psychopathy. So research examining psychopathy in early childhood suggests that more than 60% of the variation in psychopathy may be explained by genetics. However, looking across adolescence, we find that changes in psychopathic traits can be attributed to both genetics and the environment. In fact, both genetics and the environment explain equal amounts of variation in psychopathic traits during adolescence. So the focus of my research is really to identify the specific environmental factors that contribute to psychopathy and when. And there are a few key concepts from developmental psychology that guides my work in this area. The first being that youth develop within multiple environments, which individually and jointly influence development. Thinking about a kid who wakes up in the morning, he might encounter his parents as he grabs lunch before he heads to school, where he interacts with his peers. And at the end of the day, he may head back home through his neighborhood, where he may spend more time with either his friends or go back home and spend more time with his parents. The next key factor that guides my research is that environmental factors tend to have a different influence on youth depending on their age. So younger adolescents who have less control of their time may spend more of their free time at home around their parents. However, older adolescents who have more time control over their time and more autonomy tend to spend more of their free time outside of the home, and therefore their friends and their conditions of their neighborhood or other community members may become more influential. So I would like to share two studies that elucidate the environment's role in psychopathy development. In this first study, we address the question, how do environmental conditions contribute to changes in callous unemotional traits? So in this study, we used data from a longitudinal study of male youth who had been previously charged with serious crimes. And we examined whether or not environmental risk factors predicted changes in CU traits. So in this first figure, what I'm showing is how CU traits change between the ages 15 to 21. And what we see is that there are significant declines or decreases in CU traits across adolescence, which actually counters the belief that these traits are stable. We next examined how 4 aspects of their environment, negative parenting, affiliation with antisocial peers, neighborhood disorder, and community violence exposure, predicted changes in these traits. And what I'll be describing here is whether or not there is a significant association between these predictors and callous emotional traits, and whether or not the associations changed in strength over time. So looking first at the effect of antisocial peers. What we see is that there was a significant interaction between antisocial peers, exposure to community violence, and exposure to neighborhood disorder. What we find is that largely across all contexts, regardless of exposure to community violence and neighborhood disorder, greater affiliation with antisocial peers is generally associated with increases in CU traits. The only exception to this finding was among youth who experience high community violence and low neighborhood disorder. Now, looking at the effect of negative parenting, here we found a significant interaction between negative parenting, community violence exposure, and the youth's age. So among youth who are exposed to low levels of community violence, we actually see that the association between negative parenting and CU traits increases over time, with negative parenting being associated with higher CU traits among youth ages 17 to 21. Among youth who are exposed to average levels of community violence, we see that the effect of negative parenting is largely consistent over time, with negative parenting being associated with increase in CU traits at all ages. And finally, looking at youth who are exposed to high levels of community violence, we see that the effect of negative parenting decreases over time, with higher negative parenting being associated with increases in CU traits among youth between the ages of 15 and 19. So overall, these findings suggest that exposure to different environmental risk factors work together to confer risk for CU traits, but the risk that they pose may differ by the youth's age. So what we wanted to do in the next study was look into the parenting factor a little bit more. Specifically, we wanted to know whether or not the parents' own CU traits had any relation to to how youth CU traits changed over time. So in this separate study, we used data drawn from 309 male or mother and son dyads. And the sons in this study were all recruited following their first official arrest. Now, as in the previous study, we found that CU traits significantly decreased over time. What we did find in this study as well is that the level of maternal CU traits, or the CU traits that the mothers reported about themselves or having in themselves, moderated the rate of change in youth CU traits, such that with mothers who reported having high levels of CU traits, we saw that the rate of change in the son CU traits was much gradual and slower over time in comparison to youth whose mothers had high or low CU traits. So we thought that was a little interesting tidbit. So the two studies together, again, provide evidence that there is significant change in youth CU traits during adolescence, and the multiple environments that they are residing in have a significant or play a significant role in the development of psychopathic traits over time. So going back to my original question of what causes psychopathy, there's a myth that these traits are stable over time and that youth are biologically predisposed to psychopathy with little influence of environmental factors. But what the science says about this is that there is significant change, and environmental conditions contribute to those changes in psychopathic traits. Now, going to my next question. Now, this is not a question that I'm going to pose to the audience because I think we know the answer, but a common question in practice in the literature is whether or not psychopathy is a sufficient predictor of crime. And as I'm sure you're all aware of, there are a number of factors that increase the likelihood that someone commits a crime. And another key concept from developmental psychology and criminology that guides my work in this area is that environmental factors and individual characteristics work together to produce risk for criminal behavior. And again, this is true for psychopathy. Environmental factors interact with psychopathic traits to influence youth behavior. And so I'm going to just kind of show what we find in this area by sharing a study that looked at the joint influence of psychopathy and a key environmental risk factor that tends to be associated with violent or nonviolent offending, which is community violence exposure. So in this study, we first used an approach to identify subgroups of youth who exhibited similar patterns of psychopathic traits and violence exposure over time. And these figures depict what we found regarding changes or co-occurring changes in psychopathy and community violence. But I'll first walk through what we found regarding psychopathy. First, we identified a small group of youth who exhibited high levels of psychopathic traits that remained stable over time. We also identified two unique groups that exhibited elevated levels or moderate levels of psychopathic traits that decreased over time. We also identified a fourth group who had low levels of psychopathic traits that also decreased over time. Now, looking at violence exposure that co-occurred with these psychopathic trajectories, what we found is that the stable high psychopathy group and the moderate decreasing psychopathy group also reported being exposed to high levels of community violence, but that these levels decreased over time. The elevated decreasing group and the low decreasing psychopathy group both reported being exposed to low levels of community violence, and this exposure stayed stable or stayed consistent over time. We next wanted to know whether these groups engaged in different levels of antisocial behavior. And what we looked at here was violent crime, nonviolent crime, as well as substance use and substance dependency. What we first found was that the two groups who had been exposed to high levels of community violence, which are shown again in red and orange, exhibited the highest levels of violent and nonviolent offending. Interestingly, the group that had elevated but decreasing levels of psychopathy exhibited similar patterns of offending as the group with low decreasing psychopathy. Again, that elevated decrease in psychopathy had the second highest levels of psychopathic traits in the sample. But for some reason, or not for some reason, for some reason, they engaged in similar levels of offending as the group with low levels of psychopathy. Looking at substance use, what we found was that the two groups who had the highest levels of community violence exposure also reported using substances more frequently than the two other groups who had low levels of community violence exposure. And looking at substance dependency, we found that the group that had high psychopathy and high community violence reported the highest levels of substance dependency. So I know this is a lot, but overall what we're finding is that youth, regardless of their levels of psychopathic traits, if they're exposed to high levels of community violence, they tend to exhibit worse antisocial outcomes. And thus it appears that the environment may provide the conditions needed for psychopathic traits to translate into antisocial behavior. Now, environmental conditions may not be the only factor conferring risk for antisocial behavior among youth with psychopathic traits. In the next study, we examined how does age factor into the association between psychopathy and antisocial behavior. So in this study, we used data from a sample of male youth who were recruited after their first arrest to determine whether two subcomponents of psychopathy, callous unemotional traits and impulsivity, differentially predicted antisocial behavior at different points in adolescence. And here I'll be describing, again, whether or not there's a significant association between these two psychopathy predictors and each of the antisocial outcomes, and whether or not the strength of these associations change over time. Now, looking at violent offending, what we find is that both callous unemotional traits and impulsivity are significant predictors of violent offending, such that higher levels of callous unemotional traits and higher levels of impulsivity are associated with higher levels of violent offending. And this association is consistent across adolescents, so from ages 13 to 23. Looking at violent offending, we see a different pattern. Both factors are associated with adolescence with nonviolent offending across adolescence. However, the strength of these associations change over time, such that those who have callous unemotional traits are a stronger predictor of nonviolent offending in early adolescence, whereas impulsivity appears to be a stronger predictor of nonviolent offending in late adolescence. Now, finally, looking at substance use, again, we see a somewhat similar pattern, with impulsivity being a consistent predictor of substance use across adolescence. However, for callous unemotional traits, again, we see that they are a stronger predictor of substance use in early and mid-adolescence. However, by late adolescence, so around age 21, we see that callous unemotional traits are no longer a significant predictor of substance use. I know this is a lot of information, but I want to say that taken together, these findings suggest that different aspects of psychopathy pose greater risk for antisocial outcomes at different points of adolescence. So going back to the question, is psychopathy a sufficient predictor of crime? Again, the myth is that psychopathy is predictive of antisocial outcomes, regardless of environmental conditions, and that youth with psychopathic traits are not at all influenced by their environments. There's also the myth that psychopathy is consistently associated with antisocial outcomes over the lifespan. However, what the science is showing is that psychopathy, environment, and age combined are better predictors of crime rather than any one factor alone. Now, heading into my final question for the audience, is treatment effective for youth with psychopathic traits? Yes? No? Maybe? I have a few no's. All right, it seems like we're pretty split. We have 50% say yes, that treatment is effective with individuals with psychopathic traits. We have a very small percent saying that no, treatment is not effective. And we have about half of the sample, almost half of the sample, saying that maybe treatment is effective. So here's what we know about treatment of youth with psychopathic traits. As far as pharmacological approaches, there's no empirical evidence available suggesting that pharmaceuticals can treat individuals with psychopathic traits. You can treat other comorbid outcomes or comorbid disorders with these medicines, but there's nothing specific to psychopathic traits at this time. There's also no empirical evidence suggesting that legal punishments are effective deterrents for future criminal behavior among individuals with psychopathic traits, or that stays within correctional facilities lead to a reduction in either psychopathic traits or in criminal behavior among individuals with psychopathic traits. However, there is evidence suggesting supporting the effectiveness of psychological treatments, specifically those that address the environmental, affective, and cognitive risk factors associated with psychopathy. Now, breaking this down a little bit further, as I've shown throughout this presentation, there are a specific set of environmental factors that are associated with psychopathy, such as harsh parenting, affiliation with antisocial peers, and exposure to violence. Thus far, there are two effective treatment approaches that target these environmental risk factors. The first is parent management training, which teaches parents social learning techniques and behavioral strategies to increase the frequency of wanted behaviors and decrease the frequency of unwanted behaviors. These approaches also focus on enhancing warm, responsive, and consistent patterns of parenting. And these approaches often try to target the self-interest of youth, such as rewarding youth for engagement in specific positive behaviors rather than focusing on punishment alone. Now, given that many of these risk factors lie outside of the household, using a multi-systemic intervention that involves youth, families, schools, and other community members may also be effective in improving the behavioral outcomes of individuals or youth with psychopathic traits. Now, looking at the effective risk factors, the literature suggests that youth with psychopathic traits exhibit lower reactivity to stressful or threatening stimuli. And it also suggests that youth with psychopathic traits have poor emotion recognition and responsivity, particularly to expressions of fear and distress in others. Now, one effective approach that can address the latter deficit is emotion recognition training, which is often embedded in some of these other treatments and teaches youth to perceive and interpret human emotions accurately and to use this information to guide their behavior. Now, finally, looking at the cognitive risk factors associated with psychopathy, there's evidence that youth with psychopathic traits exhibit some deficits in working memory, as well as selective attention, in which they tend to over-focus on features in a given situation that are associated with reward or their specific goal, at the expense of other features that might be associated with punishment, like the presence of security cameras or security officers, or the presence of interpersonal cues such as distress or fear in the faces of others. So one effective approach that can be used to address the selective attention problems is the use of computerized trainings. Now, to make this a little bit more concrete, I want to share with you the results of one study that was conducted by my colleagues at Yale, in which they recruited 103 incarcerated adults who exhibit either high levels of psychopathic traits or externalizing tendencies. And in this study, they either matched the participants with either a treatment that addressed the specific cognitive affective deficits related to psychopathy, or the specific cognitive affective deficits related to externalizing tendencies. And these two treatment types were cognitive control, which was designed for those with externalizing tendencies, And this treatment taught participants how to inhibit their behavior or control their behavior, particularly in settings or conditions that were emotional or motivational. They also designed a treatment that taught individuals to attend to interpersonal or situational cues within their context. And this was designed to address the deficits associated with psychopathy. This included tasks like the context discrimination task, which they learned to attend to tangential information in order to respond to the target in the task, or the gaze task. It's a little bit of a scary face, or the gaze task, in which participants were trained to attend to both the eye gaze and the facial expression of the stimulus presented on the screen. Now, all of the participants in the study completed these training sessions for 1 hour, 1 hour once a week over 6 consecutive weeks. And at the end of the training period, they assessed whether or not there were improvements in this cognitive affective deficits. And they also looked at whether or not there were improvements in some of the behavioral outcomes. What they found was, for individuals with psychopathic traits, the ones that received the treatment that was designed to address their specific cognitive affective deficits, which was the attention to context treatment, actually showed a marked improvement in their cognitive performance. And it appeared that improvements on these tasks also appeared to translate to behavioral improvements, such that individuals with psychopathic traits who completed their appropriate treatment also exhibited improved behavior within the facility. And this study provides evidence that matching individuals to treatments that directly target their risks may effectively improve their cognitive affective deficits, and which may possibly improve their behavioral outcomes. So, is treatment effective for individuals with psychopathic traits? The myth is that they are unresponsive to treatment, but what the science is showing is that approaches that target the environmental and cognitive affective risk factors specific to psychopathy may effectively improve behavior and behavioral outcomes. So I've shared a lot, so I want to summarize a few key points of this presentation. First, psychopathic traits in youth are not a marker of incorrigibility. These traits change over time, and the environment plays a key role. We also know that psychopathy alone is not the best predictor of crime. The environment plays a key role here as well. And we also know that youth with psychopathic traits are indeed treatable. It's just about a matter of matching them with the correct treatment. And altogether, I hope that you can use some of this psychological science to inform legal decision-making, particularly in regard to sentencing and punishment, to create effective treatment plans for youth involved in the system, and to ultimately improve the long-term outcomes for all youth involved in the legal system. And with that, I would like to thank all of my colleagues who helped with this work, including members of the Yale Mechanisms of Disinhibition Lab, as well as the PIs of the Crossroads study, and as well as the participants who participated in the studies whose data that I used for all of this research. Also for all the people who funded this research as well. And then a big thank you to the Youth Justice Institute for inviting me here today to share this work. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simmons. So now we're going to transition into the informal conversation portion of the webinar. So first, Dr. Simmons, often in society, we label those who exhibit psychopathic traits as quote unquote psychopaths. What impacts do you think this labeling of psychopath might have for those who exhibit these traits?
Yeah, so the term psychopath is often used in particular settings to describe people who meet a certain score on a screening tool for psychopathy. But generally, mental health professionals tend to avoid labeling people with a disorder or mental health syndrome that they have to avoid the stigma that the diagnosis may carry. So as I showed at the beginning of this presentation, many people immediately jump to the assumption that psychopathy is a mental health problem that only dangerous or violent criminals have, right? And so the psychopath label may lead to individuals being viewed as more negatively in many different settings. So this translates to how we view and treat youth within the legal system, but also more broadly as a society, we tend to view individuals with psychopathic traits more negatively. So think about all of the podcasts or the pop culture articles that are like, how to spot a psychopath, how to get out of a relationship with a psychopath. We know that this is something that's really present within the broader society as something that we want to avoid. And that makes life harder for youth with psychopathic traits. Now, this negative view isn't just specific to lay people outside of the legal system or even people who work within the legal system. Even individuals who are well-versed within the mental health literature tend to view youth with psychopathic traits more negatively. For example, forensic clinicians, many developmental experts tend to view youth with psychopathic traits as more dangerous or less malleable or responsive to treatment. So really, I guess to answer your original question, the psychopath label in particular just has a really negative impact on youth in all aspects of life.
Thank you. So I have another question that's sort of related to terms that we use, and people might often use the terms psychopathy and sociopathy interchangeably. How are these terms different or similar?
So psychopathy is a recognized scientific and clinical term. Sociopathy is not. So most of us have heard the terms psychopath and sociopath used interchangeably to describe people who engage in antisocial behaviors or violent behaviors. But the term sociopath is not something that we tend to use within the research or within clinical settings anymore. At one point, or in an earlier edition of the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that clinicians use, it included a classification which was sociopathic personality disturbance, and that includes several features that are now considered to be psychopathic, such as selfishness and callousness. But it also included many features that spanned antisocial behaviors. So once antisocial personality disorder was added to the DSM, they actually dropped the sociopathic personality disturbance from the DSM. So to summarize, nobody in the scientific world uses the term sociopath. Psychopathy is the recognized scientific and clinical term. Sociopathy is not.
Thank you. You note in your presentation that the development of psychopathic traits is overwhelmingly the result of social forces. Can the development of psychopathic traits impact one developmentally such that psychological, neurological, and social forces are mutually reinforcing?
So I want to clarify one point. Psychopathic traits are strongly tied to genetics, but that is much like many other mental health problems like schizophrenia or autism. However, I want to clarify as I say that the risk is not one-to-one. There's no specific gene for psychopathy. It's the result of a combination of many hundreds or thousands of genes that we have not identified. And so some children are born with a higher risk for developing psychopathy due to these genetic factors. But whether or not that genetic risk is actually expressed is in large part due to the environmental conditions. So if they're exposed to harsh parenting, if they're residing in unsupportive environments, that might lead to the expression of that genetic risk. But circling back to your original question, yes, the development of psychopathic traits, there is a bidirectional association or relationship between psychopathy and many of these social environmental risk factors. So thinking about negative parenting in particular, I showed that negative parenting is a risk factor for psychopathy, but thinking about a kid with psychopathic traits, who's impulsive, who is callous, who doesn't care about your well-being. Many of those features might elicit negative parenting behaviors from the parents themselves, right? So whereas negative parenting leads to psychopathy, psychopathy also might lead to negative parenting. Another key factor to note here is the issue of self-selection. So there might be a case in which youth with psychopathic traits tend to select into situations that might reinforce those traits. So maybe they make friends with other antisocial peers. Maybe they have to move into neighborhoods with greater socioeconomic disadvantage and higher levels of violence because they're not able to hold down a job. So many of these bidirectional relationship or bidirectional associations and self-selection processes do serve to reinforce psychopathic traits. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I'll go ahead and ask one more before we move over to the audience Q&A portion. So I often think that as society, we approach the topic of those with psychopathic traits from a place of fear or thinking that those with such traits are inherently evil, as you put it. How might we reframe our thinking so that we can ensure better outcomes for these youth, and how can we better support them?
So I think we need to move away from viewing psychopathy as something that is, I think we need to better understand psychopathy and view it as we would view any other mental health problem. So as I noted very briefly in the introduction of my presentation, psychopathic traits are related to a number of maladaptive outcomes like academic failure, low relationship quality, employment problems, and just a generally lower quality of life. And that is true for many other mental health disorders. However, when we see that, we tend to try to find ways to address the disorder itself and improve these other outcomes so that they have a higher level quality of life. With other mental health disorders, we also tend to think about how those disorders may influence the person's behaviors and actions and evaluate them with those things in mind, right? So I think overall, what we should do is start viewing psychopathy as a mental disorder and thinking about how we can more fairly interact and treat youth with psychopathic traits.
Thank you. So we're going to begin the audience Q&A now, but as a reminder, after the Q&A and closing remarks, we will be showing one clip from the Long Island Regional Youth Justice Team's Words from My Soul project. So be sure to stick around after the Q&A for that short clip. But now we'll go ahead and move straight over to audience Q&A. And we have plenty of questions from our audience who seem to be super engaged today. So first, is callous unemotional the same as psychopathy? And if not, what are the differences?
Yeah, so I think it's really hard because I use them interchangeably, or not necessarily interchangeably, but I use them both throughout the presentation. So callous unemotional traits represent the affective component and some of the interpersonal component of psychopathy. But we tend to not label youth as psychopaths just because of the stigma associated with it. And we also view the combination of callous emotional traits with conduct disorder as a precursor to adult psychopathy. And so really, callous emotional traits are just a one part of the broader psychopathy construct that we can reliably assess in children. And we use to kind of guide our decision-making regarding treatment and things like that.
Thank you. And as a follow-up question to that, somebody else asked, how can I access more information on CU traits online?
Oh, yeah. So I'm hopefully going to provide a few links to different articles that I think can be really helpful. All of these I'm trying to find a lot of open access ones so that you don't have to pay to read research that should be freely available. But I also highly recommend there's a new organization, Psychopathy is, which is a group of academic researchers who are trying to dispel myths about psychopathy and raise awareness about psychopathy, given its huge impact on people's lives. So that resources have, or that there's a website, I think it's like psychopathyis.org. It has a lot of information about the development of psychopathy, treatment options, and things like that there. It's not used to diagnose anything, so I wouldn't view it as a resource for that, but you can find a lot of information on that website, and a lot of great videos, a lot of great resources.
Thank you. And next, how is psychopathy measured? This individual states, I know that there's a lot of history on properly measuring psychopathic traits.
Yeah, so there are a number of screening tools. So I guess what would be considered the gold standard or the OG measure would be the psychopathy checklist. That has been adopted to measure, there's a youth version that was adopted to measure these traits in youth. But there's also a number of other measures that are more specific to youth traits, such as the Inventory of Callous Emotional Traits, which was designed by Dr. Paul Frick at Louisiana State University. That one is often used. But I can't express this enough, there's a number of different ways of assessing psychopathy. They all try to tap into the same facets, but there's a number out there. I believe there's a new article out in Nature Reviews Disease Primers. I know that's a lot to remember, but it goes into some of the assessment considerations as well. That's a free article, and I recommend reading that if you have more questions in this area.
Thank you. So historically, there's been evidence that treatment can worsen outcomes in adult psychopaths. Is there comparable evidence in youth?
The evidence in youth suggests that there may be some treatments that are less effective in youth with psychopathic traits. They may be less responsive. It might be a result of using treatments that are not tapping into or directly targeting their specific cognitive, affective, or environmental needs. And that might be why we see that these treatments are not effective, and also might be why there has been a prevailing idea that youth with psychopathic traits are not responsive to treatment. It's just been largely due to the fact that we're not using the right treatments. So yeah, that's what I would say on that front. I would also say that there's some evidence suggesting that there may be improvements in these outcomes after treatment, but they may not reach what we would consider like a normative level of functioning. But it is an improvement overall. So that, I think, is what the evidence or what the science is saying regarding that idea.
And can you say more about how antisocial behavior is measured in this research? For this age group, antisocial behavior can also be prosocial.
Yeah, I really love that idea as well, like thinking about theft. There was a well-known police department recently that tweeted out a photo of an arrest that was made. They caught these criminals, and what they found was that they had all stolen diapers and soap and other like baby food and things like that. So oftentimes what we would consider to be antisocial might be done for prosocial goals. Within the studies that I showed, all of the measures of antisocial behavior, particularly those that were looking at offending, tapped into things like assault, battery, shooting, firing a weapon at someone, fighting, things that we would consider to be more antisocial than prosocial. And then the substance use outcomes were things like, how often do you use a number of substances, including like marijuana, alcohol, cocaine, and other more illicit substances as well. So we tried to tap into more of the, I guess, prototypical antisocial outcomes. But again, I think this idea of pro-social, of thinking about these behaviors in pro-social ways is something that we should explore a little bit more, of how we can maybe harness these traits for good, or kind of rethink about psychopathy in a way that might be beneficial.
Got it. And do you have any success stories regarding someone with psychopathic traits?
So I am personally not a clinician. I am primarily a developmental researcher, so I don't have any experience with treatment in clinical settings. So unfortunately, I don't have any personal stories regarding the success rate or regarding a successful case of treatment.
And based on what you've presented today, what are the likely implications of the impact of increased gun violence and the pandemic on youth with antisocial behaviors?
Yeah, I think there are a number of criminological theories that can actually speak to the conditions of the pandemic, which brought about a lot of uncertainty, which brought about a lot of socioeconomic risk as far as losing jobs, the sources of income, and things like that. All of those are associated with antisocial behavior. People are particularly stressed. People have additional time to spend in their communities. There's a lot of things that might play into the increase in gun violence during that period. What I also want to note is that overall violence, as historically, is still at a relatively low rate. I know that there has been an increase in the past year, but I don't think necessarily that psychopathic traits play a direct role in that finding, in that uptick. But I think some of these broader societal factors, we need to think through a little bit more about the role of those things, rather than focusing on individual characteristics or individual problems.
Thank you. How accessible is treatment? Do you need to be referred, and could it be covered by insurance?
Again, these are things that I don't quite know. I wish I did, and I could provide some more input on this. But again, I would suggest going to the Psychopathy Is website. I think it has some more information regarding treatment options. But I think many of these things are experimental. Many of these things are like very localized to the different universities that are running these kind of larger interventions. But I think there are more and more options out there. I would check with different mental health providers, particularly those who specialize in externalizing problems, conduct problems, things like that, to see what options are available in your area.
Thank you. And the next, I had a measurement question. Can you explain what is meant by neighborhood disorder and how it was measured in your study?
Yeah, neighborhood disorder is thought to be an indirect indicator of neighborhood disadvantage. It includes both social and physical disorder. So physical disorder are direct signs of I can't find the word right now, but the items assess things like the presence of graffiti, the presence of drug paraphernalia on the streets, empty buildings, dilapidation, things like that. The social disorder questions address whether or not there are individuals in your community who are fighting within the streets or using substances within the streets, things like that. So it was tried. It's considered a proxy for other for neighborhood disadvantage and things like that.
Thank you. And then we'll go ahead and move on to one more audience question. So is there a difference in how psychopathic traits presents itself based on gender?
Yeah, so this is like an understudied area, which I think is really interesting. So psychopathy is considered to be more prevalent in males than females, but I think those numbers are changing over time. As far as the direct expression of these traits, I can't speak on exactly what would be the key differences in that area. I have not done as much work in this area, and the field overall hasn't done enough work in this area. But I do know that if we're thinking about the environmental factors that contribute to psychopathy, we know that females are more often exposed to violence and maltreatment, particularly within the home, whereas males are more often likely to affiliate with antisocial peers. So there are gender differences in the risk factors for psychopathy. We also know that there's gender differences in some of these antisocial outcomes as well. I think we all here know that males are more likely to engage in antisocial behavior like criminal offending, fighting, things like that. So I think this is an area that needs more exploration as far as the presentation of these traits among the females.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simmons. So really, Dr. Simmons, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the YJI and everyone in attendance today for taking the time to share this incredibly important information with us. Before I get to the closing announcements, do you have any final thoughts for us?
As a developmental psychologist, my guiding mantra is that all youth have the potential for change. Regardless of what they've done, where they're from, or who they are, if we put in the time and resources, we can help youth achieve their goals and become productive citizens. So don't give up on any youth whatsoever. So yeah.
Thank you so much. So thank you again, Dr. Simmons. Before closing announcements, we would like to ask you all how you felt about today's webinar. So in a moment, I'll be launching a poll question asking how much you agree or disagree with the statement, this webinar was informative. Please answer this question to the best of your ability so that we know how today's webinar went for each of you. While everyone's answering that question, I do have a few announcements and items to put on your radar. So for the next session of our Lunch and Learn series, we will be hosting Dr. Erin Carrison, who is the assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare at University of California, Berkeley. She'll be discussing policing and youth, and the registration information will be posted on the YJI website soon. Immediately following this webinar, we'll be sending a survey to you all via email. If you have the time, please complete this survey as it allows us to provide further feedback and questions. This information is also used to improve future webinar sessions. The survey total should take no longer than 5 minutes, and we'll also be putting a link to this survey in the chat momentarily. Finally, if you have not already done so, please feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. And just a reminder, the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. In closing, I just want to thank all of you for taking part in this session of the YJI Lunch and Learn series. We hope that you've gained something from this webinar and that you continue to think about the work that Dr. Simmons has presented to us today. We also look forward to seeing you at future YJI events and webinars.